Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's good, guys? We are back with another episode this week, and I'm really excited about this one. We're going to get into Artemis II, and I know everybody's talking about that right now, and I really wanted to do a breakdown on an occulted level on what a lot of these symbols mean, why the Artemis II is going up in the air. I know some people question whether it's going into space or not. I know I've got a large following of flat earth listeners who don't believe that there is space at all. So it's very interesting what we can surmise from this. And I have some ideas, but really we're going to hone in and stay in the pocket of the occult symbolism today, right? We're not going to get too far out on what's fake, what's not. We're going to look at more of the why they're doing what they're doing today, because I think that's the most important thing. Whether you believe there's space, whether you believe that this mission is real or not, it's the meaning behind it. It's what they're doing. So that's the most important thing, because that in and of itself is a ritual. And we're going to look at some of the ritualistic aspects of it. And I'm going to suggest that there is some reality to what they are doing. Now, it depends on what side of the coin you fall on, and whether you believe that there's a vast universe that God created, or if you believe we're in a snow globe. Either or, it still is applicable to both sides. So I think that everybody can come together in this truther community on this topic with the way that I'm going to present it today, because we're not going to look at the aspects of real and fake of what they're doing so much as the symbolism behind it. Now, I want to break down NASA, at least some of the occult origins of it and some of the people involved, because that's going to bring us directly to the Artemis Project and what they have prepared for in the Artemis Project. And then specifically, we'll talk about Artemis II and what they're doing with it right now and what the symbolism means behind it. And for those that have been under a shell for any part of their life, NASA stands for National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and it is the independent agency of the U.S. federal government responsible for the United States civil space program and for research in aeronautics and space. Their headquarters is in Washington, D.C., but they have several different field centers, 10 total around the U.S., and they've led several different space programs throughout, including Project Mercury, Project Gemini. We know about Skylab, Space Shuttle, the Apollo programs, and now we're moving into the Artemis program, which by the final phase of the Artemis program in 2028, they are talking about putting a base on the moon. So again, regardless of what you believe, that's going up and away, they are at least saying that this is what they're trying to do. And I think it goes deeper than just the superficial, surface level conspiratorial nonsense that I hear consistently, that it's just all about siphoning the U.S. tax dollars from the hardworking U.S. citizen to dump into something fake to trick us. No, I think they are using that money to do something that is far more occulted in nature than what most people would believe. And I think that's something that we have to look at the layers and the people involved to really be able to say that there's more going on here than meets the eye, Transformers pun included. If you've seen The Dark Side of the Moon, you'll know what I mean. So before we get into the people involved with the beginnings of NASA, there's one thing I want to dispel real quickly, and it's one of those pet peeves that I have in the conspiratorial truther world, and I know most of the people that have been following me up until this point know the one thing that really bothers me is when there's jargon that goes around in the conspiratorial world that is absolutely false, but everyone propagates as truth and it becomes conspiratorial propaganda. I'm all about pointing the finger at people and entities and government entities that are doing things that are trying to keep us locked in the matrix metaphorically, but there has to be a line drawn with actual research done. And one of those is the idea that NASA means to deceive in the Hebrew. And I'm going to break down what that actually means in the Hebrew and what NASA actually means in the Hebrew. So NASA is the Hebrew word that means to lift, carry, bear, or take. And it's in the context of lifting up one's eyes or carrying a load. So that is what NASA means. It does not mean to deceive. Nashal, which is Nashah, completely different phonetically and distinct from NASA in the Hebrew, that means to deceive or deception. And you'll find that in Jeremiah 49:16. So Nashal is what means to deceive. It's not NASA. And you see these things happen on social media all the time. You know, it's like the idea that conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists, the words started with the CIA. It didn't. It actually started in the late 1800s. So it was something that the CIA used during the JFK assassination time, but it's not something that they actually started. It's these things, I guess, that I want to try to get right, because I know there are people out there ready to throw missiles if you're getting things wrong. And there's a lot wrong within the truth or conspiratorial world. And listen, I'm not here to beat anyone over the head. You're right. NASA's up to no good. And I'm with you there 100%. But at least let's try to get some of these things right. And that's one of the things I want to kick this off with, that NASA does not mean to deceive in the Hebrew. It actually means lifting up one's eyes or carrying a load. That's what it actually means. So let's look at the occult origins of NASA. And we won't spend a whole long time on that, because I do want to get to the Artemis program, and I want to talk about Artemis II and the symbolism there. But I think it's important that we can set this foundation and some of the things that are involved with this foundation of NASA tied directly into the Artemis project and what's going on there, and even with Artemis II. So you can kind of start this with Aleister Crowley, shocker, because he was a major influence on a particular person, Jack Parsons. And Jack Parsons, just prior to the Second World War, and a handful of his Caltech buddies, they were working on perfecting solid fuel rocket propulsion. Now, they were limping along on a shoestring budget. They weren't really able to get anything off the ground, but they drew attention from the Defense Department, and the Defense Department decided to help them and start funding them. And they helped start JPL in Pasadena, California, which stands for Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And what would happen is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, this was the precursor to that. This was the start of the advanced space rocket design that helped to build the rocketry that allows for these spaceships to go up into the sky. Now, notice I said up into the sky because I'm being nice to my flat earth brothers and sisters here, and we'll just say that it goes up. I, however, think that there is a higher probability that there are things going into space. Howbeit, I don't think that's what they're showing us by any stretch of the imagination. Now, Parsons was super fascinated with the occult, and if you know anything about this channel, this podcast, I've talked a lot about Jack Parsons and his connection to Aleister Crowley. And in 1941, he joined the Pasadena chapter of Ordi Templi Orientis, which was Aleister Crowley's secret society. It was what he was originally trying to set up in the United States, in Detroit, that didn't really come to fruition. Now, C.S. Jones, his spiritual son, helped to facilitate that later. Now, Parsons ends up taking over the Agape Lodge himself later on, and he becomes a successor to Aleister Crowley, at least in a lot of people's eyes. Now, he also addressed Aleister Crowley in several letters as most beloved father, so he kind of looked at himself as also a spiritual son. Now, Crowley identified himself as a prophet, and he was supposed to bring in this Aeon of Horus, and we will talk about how the Aeon of Horus ties directly into the Artemis project and this idea of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, and we're going to talk about Semiramis and Tammuz today, and we're going to talk about all of these different gods and goddesses and what they have to do with rocketry, what they have to do with space travel. You know, why is this a consistent theme for something that's supposedly devoid of religion, supposedly devoid of anything that would be considered to be anti-science? We also know in 1904 that Aleister Crowley, along with his current wife, Rose Edith Kelly, they go on a honeymoon in Cairo, Egypt, and this is when he meets Aiwass, and he writes the Book of the Law. And as a matter of fact, Aiwass declares, "I am God of war and vengeance." This is important because we're going to talk about Ares today too, and we're going to talk about some of the significance, again, with these gods and goddesses that are tied directly into NASA and these programs. So when he receives this Book of the Law from Aiwass, there are 3 mantra-like verses that are given to him. And 2 of them you have probably heard me say on this show several times, but the third one I don't know if I've ever gone into. But there is, "Do what thou wilt shall be of the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will." And the third one is very interesting. "And every man and every woman is a" what? Star. So this is also the idea of star seeds. This is kind of that first little bit of push towards this movement. And Crowley himself even suggested that throughout his life, that the idea of what we would consider to be angels and demons would be later referred to as something else. Now, that something else comes along in the form of Kenneth Grant, who was also a student of Aleister Crowley, and he says that Aiwass and subsequently Lamb are extraterrestrials. He actually says that Aiwass is an extraterrestrial from Sirius and the stellar representation of what? The Egyptian goddess Isis. So let's keep this in mind, these goddesses in particular, because when we talk about Artemis and we talk about the Artemis project, it's going to be very important to what kind of agenda they're pushing with this symbolic imagery. Also in 1944, Aleister Crowley quotes and says, "My observation of the universe convinces me that there are beings of intelligence and power of a far higher quality than anything we can conceive of as human. They are not necessarily based on the cerebral and nervous structures that we know, and that the only one and only chance for mankind to advance as a whole is for individuals to make contact with such beings." So this is Crowley even before the extraterrestrial push, which, by the way, the year that Crowley dies in 1947 is the year that extraterrestrials and UFOs explode, specifically in the United States. And I don't think that was any kind of coincidence. I think that was actually by design. And I think that happened after this Amalantra working. And we won't go through the Amalantra working again today, guys. I've talked about it plenty of times on the show. We do know that his Scarlet Woman at the time, Roddy Minor, and he were in New York, and they were contacting this wizard Amalantra in the astral. And this is where he meets the way in Tibetan Lamb. And this is where we get our first imagery of the gray alien that we now see that has absolutely flooded the specifically United States zeitgeist, but in many UFO abductions around the world. And some people directly correlate that event to opening up a portal to allow these entities in. And listen, I'm not against that, but I do think there's another event that happens, one that I've talked also about on the show. And we're going to talk specifically about Jack Parsons' event in 1945. And he is joined by Ron Hubbard, the late founder of Scientology. And as a matter of fact, when Jack Parsons writes to Aleister Crowley in a letter, he says, and I quote, "I deduce that he was in direct touch with some higher intelligence. He is the most thelemic person I have ever met and is in complete accordance with our principles," which is super interesting because Parsons and Hubbard are going out into the desert trying to complete what they call the Babylon working. They're trying to bring forth the Antichrist and the apocalypse, and they're trying to open up this gateway to the gods. And again, we're not going to rehash all that today, but what is said is that they opened a portal out in the desert, something came out, and it never got closed. And we're going to talk about why that it was more than likely never closed. And Aleister Crowley talks about this specific event that Jack Parsons and Hubbard are doing. He writes a letter to Grady McCurdy, and Grady McCurdy was a ceremonial magician, student of Aleister Crowley, and he followed the adherents of Thelema. Also, what's very interesting is he was a part of the Reserves Officer Training Corps here in the U.S. And after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he goes into active duty. He was actually in off and on again active duty into the 1960s. He did 30 years of reserve service. And again, here's this connection to these high-level occultists who are deep into the government and military spaces. Which interesting is he has a conversation in the 1970s with Jacques Vallée, and Jacques Vallée is blown away with all of the years of military service that he's had. So again, super interesting, but he's a follower of Aleister Crowley, and Crowley writes a letter to him, and he says, "It is not good talking about Frater 210 coming over." So Frater 210 is the adopted Thelemic title of Jack Parsons. He went by Frater Topan, Topan, and it stands for Thelema Obtenteum Proemdero Amoris Nuptii. And it's actually a mistranslation, a Latin mistranslation of the establishment of Thelema through the rituals of love. As a matter of fact, Crowley makes fun of Jack Parsons for mistranslating this, even though that Jack Parsons continues to go by Frater Tupan. But there's a meaning behind Tupan because it's the declaration Tupan, this declaration Tupan. So there was a meaning behind it, and the Kabbalistic numerology behind it is 210. And if you look into what 210 means when it is in connection with rabbinic tradition, it actually stands for the enslavement time that the Israelites were with Egypt, 210 years. It was the fulfillment of the 400-year prophecy beginning after Isaac's birth. So it represents, after this 400 years, this rebirth. So he is stating himself to be this Frater, essentially rebirth, and he is in this declaration to Pan. So this is when Crowley is writing to McMurdy, and he is saying, it is not good talking about Frater 210 coming over. He goes further. He has got under the influence of a person whom I believe to be an ordinary con man. He's talking about L. Ron Hubbard. At any rate, he is acting quite insanely. And as far as I can see, both deceitfully and dishonorably, I'm still waiting to hear whether the adverb dishonesty should not be added to this list. In any case, he would not come because, oh, curse these people who have no ideas of their own and can do nothing but pick up my ideas and try to put them into operation without in the least understanding them or knowing how to bring them to success. Apparently, he or Ron or somebody is producing a moonchild. I get fairly frantic when I contemplate the idiocy of these goats. I apologize to goats. So Crowley is saying that they don't know what they're doing. And I think that a lot of people would go down that path when it comes to the Babylon working, that, yeah, they completed it, but they didn't know how to close it back up. And I think it would be well within Crowley's wheelhouse to say that, because let's look back years earlier when we look at Boleskine House and this monstrosity that he supposedly let out there, and he didn't get back into a portal. So I would say that he's speaking more from experience. And again, Crowley's super arrogant at this point, and he believes himself to be at the apex of occult practices. Whether that's true or not, who knows, right? But that's what he believed himself to be. But at least he would have had experience at that point to know that, hey, these guys are messing around, because we're talking about the 1940s at this point, and Crowley has years and years of experience at this point. We're talking about 50 years of experience in the occult, and he obviously is in the belief that they're just rookies out here doing that. And yeah, if they're rookies out there doing it and they open up a veil and let something through, it makes a lot of sense. And guess what happens a year and a half later after the Babylon working is completed? 1947, Kenneth Arnold sighting over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. What happens else? Roswell happens, Greys show up, all this stuff happens. Crowley ends up dying the same year. So I believe that the working worked. However, they didn't get everything back in there. And I think also that these entities, this was by their design, right? This was the help they needed to be able to allow more of what they wanted into our world. Now, you may be asking, how does this tie directly into NASA? And obviously, Jack Parsons does because of working with JPL, but we have some other people who are German of origin who are also connected to some of these workings, specifically the Amalantra working that happens in 1918. So in 1918, the Amalantra workings happens. Crowley meets Lamb, meets Amalantra. Greys are in the zeitgeist at this point. In 1919, members of an occult group in Germany called the Vril Society, they claim to establish a telepathic contact through a trance medium called Maria Orsic. And I've spoken about Maria Orsic before, but I plan on doing a deeper dive on her because it's super interesting. And a lot of it said not to be true, but so many people have written books about her to say that, no, I think it's more of a cover up. But she said that she established contact with beings from the Aldebaran star system in the constellation of Taurus. And she said these aliens were said to have gifted the Vril Society with flying saucer technology. And we've talked about that. We've talked about the Flugerads and Admiral Byrd and these UFOs with swastikas on them. And it's very interesting that a lot of this pops off in Germany prior to what's happening in the 1940s here in the US. And this happens after the Amalantra workings. And it's interesting that this Maria Orsic, who was said to show up around 1895, nobody knows where she left or if she passed or what. We don't really know a lot about her, but they said that she was the significant power behind the throne in Nazi Germany. And she was the leader of the Vril Society. And they consider her to be part of that Black Lodge that we've talked about a lot on this show. And she was supposedly behind Hitler as well. And the idea of getting these mysteries from this non-human intelligence, such as UFOs and Nikola Tesla's search for free energy sources, that they found that out. Now, obviously, they didn't give it to us plebes, but they did find this out supposedly from these Vrilia that Maria Orsic was in contact with. But this goes a little bit further. So we've got German rocket engineer Hermann Oberth. Now, Hermann Oberth was a space authority UFO lecturer, and he ends up being the head of the U.S. Caltech laboratories in 1955. Now, check this out. He said, and this is on record, "We cannot take all the credit for our record advancements in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped." When asked by whom, he replied, "The people of other worlds." So even he is saying that the technology that they're getting was from non-human intelligence. Well, here's another interesting thing. He was super tied in with the Nazis. Clearly, he's German. He doesn't come over here as a part of Project Paperclip because he wasn't involved in the development of the V2 rocket. What ends up happening is, though, he comes over here in 1955, ends up working for his former assistant, guess who? Wernher von Braun, and starts developing space rockets for NASA in Huntsville, Alabama. It gets better. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, he starts talking a lot about unidentified flying objects, and he starts talking about extraterrestrials and their contact with mankind. And he talks about how that he believes that these UFOs are manned by intelligent observers who are members of a race that have been investigating our Earth for centuries. So it's kind of the age-old ancient alien theorist ideas, the idea that these beings came and created mankind, because a lot of these scientists have said that. Now, again, we've seen a huge shift in just the last 10 years about what the government's actually saying about what these entities are, and start using the terminology non-human intelligence. They're not saying they're from outer space anymore. However, I think they will use that as a part of whatever they give us when they start telling us that they've been in contact with these things. And think about it. One of Crowley's main goals in practicing Western magic was to advance what? Humanity by contact with higher intelligence, Praetor intelligence, Albaldees, Amalantra, Lamb, Iowas, many others. And he passes this on to Jack Parsons. He passes this on to Kenneth Grant, several others. And these guys get integrated within government systems. And we're just talking about Herman Oberth, who is connected directly to Wernher von Braun, who Wernher von Braun was one of the biggest catalysts for setting up NASA here in the United States. And it gets better when you look at what Himmler was connected to. Himmler actually formed a new occult order of Teutonic Knights, and this was a direct trickle down from the Armanaschaft. Now, the Armanaschaft is also called the Armanan Order, and it was started as a neo-pagan esoteric society, and it started with the teachings of a Guido Carl Anton List, and he was an Austrian occultist, journalist, playwright, and novelist. And he believed in Wotan, or Odin, and he believed that the Christians came to get rid of, to erase who the real God was, who was Odin. So Heinrich Himmler starts a new occult order off of this particular order, the Armanahan order that List started prior. So here's another massive occult connection that ties directly into NASA, because guess what? Himmler comes to NASA via Paperclip to work for Wernher von Braun. So here we are again. Here are these guys who are from occult orders from Germany or from occult secret societies here in the United States who are helping build NASA. Well, it gets a little bit more interesting when we start looking at the first moon landing, or supposed first moon landing. And we want to talk about a couple of guys. Neil Armstrong, we're going to talk about Buzz Aldrin. And again, guys, we're looking at symbolism. We're looking at what they're doing. I'm not going to sit here and tell you about fake or real with the moon landings. However, I can tell you that I'm not in the camp of thinking that the first moon landing was real by any stretch. But what I can say is what they did in a ritualistic manner from that was a part of moving us into this new aeon, or what they're trying to do is move us into this end times that we talk about a lot on the show. So during the Apollo 11 landing, Neil Armstrong hops out for his famous moonwalk. While he's doing that, 33rd degree Freemason Buzz Aldrin stays inside the lunar model. While he's in the lunar model, he performs a Masonic ritual to honor Isis. Now, what's very interesting about that is when you look up what he was said to do, he says he was performing a Christian communion with bread and wine to mark the momentous occasion. However, this came down directly from the Freemasons. He also has a hand sewn with a gold border flag that has the double-headed eagle, a cross of Salem, and square and compass with the letter G that represented the Scottish Rite Freemasonry flag. So he has this in the lunar model while he's performing this ritual to Isis. Again, he's trying to play it off and say that it is a Christian communion that he's doing in this lunar model. And listen, he might have been doing some sort of communion, but I can tell you it wasn't to Jesus Christ. I can promise you that. Also, what's interesting about Neil Armstrong, and I looked into this, was Neil Armstrong a Freemason? Well, no, that we know of. And I'm going to tell you why I say that. He's not recorded as being a Freemason, but his father, Stephen Armstrong, was an active Freemason. And that is one of the interesting pieces. And we see this a lot, right? We see where a guy, he moves into a prominent position with the government as a celebrity, and he's not on the books as being in one of these secret societies, but he's got family members that are prominent family members. So I think that whether he was or he wasn't, he was definitely influenced by Freemasonry. And clearly they were doing some sort of Freemasonic ritual while they were, quote unquote, on the moon. So again, it's about what they're trying to usher in. This isn't about whether they went to space or not. It's about what they're trying to show us. And it's what they're trying to get us to actively participate in without us knowing it. And another thing we have to consider as well, and it's one of the other aspects that I've looked into when it comes to what they're trying to access, right? And this will move us into Artemis II and what they're trying to do with all these rockets too, right? And again, flat Earth or not flat Earth, I believe this is applicable to both, what they're trying to access. And I think this is going to go directly into Nimrod here in a minute. But one of the things we can look at is alchemy. And we can look at something called the prima materia. Now, the prima materia is considered the first matter, and it is considered to be the material that's required to perform the magnum opus or to create the Philosopher's Stone. And it's considered to be the formless base of all matter. And it's considered to be chaos. So it would be directly tied into chaos magic because you're using the chaos to create order, depending on, obviously, what your magnum opus is. Everyone's magnum opus isn't the same thing. Now, a lot of times it's attributed to Aristotle, that Aristotle was one of the first ones to talk about it. He was. I will say this, though, author Edward Waite, and I've talked about him on this show, and he was a part of the Golden Dawn during the period of time that Aleister Crowley was, and he and Aleister Crowley did not like each other, and I've talked about that a lot, but he was in several different secret societies. He was a Freemason, obviously the Golden Dawn, and he was in the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia as well. Now, he actually states when it comes to the prima materia, he says that alchemical writers concealed the real name, its true name. So it goes back to occult blinds and twilight language and what the real name for this prima materia is, or the Azoth, and many other names that are used for this, but obviously, supposedly the real name, only true alchemists, the true adepts, actually know what it is. And to look even further into the prima materia, we can look at a compendium of many different alchemical writings, and it's in 6 volumes. It's called the Theatrum Chemicum, and the Theatrum Chemicum states they have compared the prima materia to everything, to male and female, here we go with the androgyny, to the hermaphroditic monster, to heaven and earth, to body and spirit, chaos, microcosm, and the confused mass. It contains in itself all colors and potentially all metals. There is nothing more wonderful in the world, for it begets itself, conceives itself, and gives birth to itself. So the idea is that when people are trying to access these other worlds by whatever means, and again, we're going to get to Nimrod here in a little bit and what they were trying to access there in Babel, but we're going to talk about these rockets and what they may be trying to access as well. Are they trying to access some form of the prima materia? And I think we can say that's a huge possibility. Look at what all these occultists and alchemists have always tried to do, complete the great work. Do you not think that Jack Parsons, when he was helping create rocketry, is known as the father of modern rocketry, that he himself, that was a part of his great work? Absolutely. They were looking at accessing this connection to these beings that are not of this world. And wherever you believe they're from, they're not of this world, and this is what these people and in our governments are trying to get in contact with. And I think they are in contact with it as well. So let's start looking at the Artemis program, because this is going to get real interesting now, and we're going to really get into what is the ritualism that is built around this Artemis program. Now, the Artemis program is a moon exploration program, and it's led by NASA, and it was established in 2017. And the hope is, and I said this earlier, by 2028, they hope to land humans on the moon for the first time since Apollo 17 in 1972. It's not missed on me, guys, that it's taken us this long to get back to the moon and why, right? That's a whole different episode, whole different discussion. We're not here to talk about that today, but I'm going to throw that out there. I'm not blind to that fact by any stretch of the imagination. It's weird. We know it's weird, and we know that things aren't adding up with any of that. But the goal is that each Artemis project, by the time that they get to 2028, they're going to start building a permanent lunar base on the moon, which I find very fascinating. There are so many different elements to that. But again, we're going to really hone in on the symbolism behind it and why that either they want us to believe that they're doing so or they are trying to do so. And in my opinion, if we're going to the moon, if we have gone to the moon, I would suggest that there would be something on the moon already, guys. This is just for show. Whatever they're showing us is for show, period. You believe in space or not believe in space, everything they show us is for show. It's not what's really going on in outer space or in another realm, depending on what you believe. So let's start really digging into the occult connections with the Artemis project. Let's look at Artemis and what Artemis actually means in Greek mythology. She's the goddess of the moon, shocker. She is the goddess of wilderness and the hunt, and we'll talk about how that comes into play too. And it also makes sense that they are trying to land what? The first woman on the moon. They actually just sent the first woman into space, supposedly, but she's a part of this project. And we're going to talk about Artemis and how that she is directly tied in to this divine feminine. Talk about a lot on the show. We're going to talk about all the different goddesses that move through this chain that Artemis is a part of. And this is in direct correlation with Apollo. And we know that Apollo is the twin brother of Artemis. And again, they're going to say, oh yeah, they're these mythological gods and goddesses, and we're just using their names because it sounds cool. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what they've said. And I actually dug into it a little bit just to see what the mainstream side of things was saying. And in May of 2019, Jim Bridenstine, and he is the NASA administrator, he actually convened with all of these different people, even Vice President Mike Pence at the time, and they wanted to talk about sending people back to the moon by 2024. Obviously, that's not going to happen because the Artemis project is spanning longer than that, but that was the idea at the time. And they needed to come up with a name. And he said, and I quote, "There's no cohesive story. I'm trying to mobilize people, but we don't have a program. We have parts and pieces. We need to name it. We need a brand for this." See, it's always about a brand. It's always about some sort of iconography, some sort of mimetic magic that they can draw us in with. And this is exactly what he's looking for. Now, again, he sounds very innocent here. So he ends up going to talk to Alex McDonald, and McDonald was NASA's chief economist and author of The Long Space Age, The Economic Origins of Space Exploration from Colonial America to the Cold War. And he goes to talk to him about, what are we going to call this? And so McDonald tells Bridenstine we could always go back to Artemis. And Bridenstine is confused because he says, Artemis, well, we already did that. And they already did an earlier mission called Artemis. But McDonald says, no, don't worry about it. Nobody will remember those missions. Let's bring this back. And then he brings up the fact that Artemis was the twin sister of Apollo, and she would represent this goddess of the moon because they're trying to go back to the moon. Now, they admit that, right? They admit that this is what they're using, but they say it's just mythology. It doesn't mean anything. It's just metaphorical. It has nothing to do with anything occulted in nature. Well, I just spent the last 30 to 40 minutes explaining to you in a nutshell how that the entire basis of NASA is built on the occult. So to say that these guys are just, oh man, that sounds good. That's the sister of Apollo. Oh man, we're going to do that. Yeah. I don't believe it for a minute. And I believe that it's all calculated. I believe that they are actively looking to open up portals, open up veils to get in even more contact with these visitors that they've been in contact with for a while. Now, Artemis II currently is in the air for 10 days, supposedly. And the astronauts involved are Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. He's the first non-US citizen to go to space, supposedly. And Christina Cook is the first female to go to space. And this is very important. And I'm going to show some pictures up here of their first supposed pictures from the lunar model looking back at the Earth. Who are they showing? It's Christina Cook. They're putting a big emphasis on Christina Cook as being this very focal part of this mission, combined with the fact they call it Artemis. And we're going to get into why they're doing that. Now, we're going to jump into some scripture today, and we're actually going to touch on a lot of scripture today. But one of the things that we're going to do as we're looking at scripture, we're going to look at some of these ancient societies and what they did and what we're trying to resurrect now, what we're trying to replicate, albeit in a different manner, but we're trying to replicate what these ancient societies, specifically the ones in Babel or Babylon and Nimrod, and what they were trying to do with this tower, which I believe was a Stargate. And yes, we can consider it to be a ziggurat, but what was on top of that ziggurat? And I think we need to look at ancient technology and, again, what we're trying to do in a different manner now. So we're going to look at Genesis 10, and we're going to look at verse 8. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. His kingdom began in Babylon, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and the land of Shinar. From that land, he went forth into Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and the great city of Calah. So this is one of our first instances of understanding who Nimrod is. Now we're going to look at Genesis 11 now. Now, Nimrod is not specifically talked about here, but we can find the correlation between the scriptures, and then we're going to look at what some other people have said outside of the Bible as well. So Genesis 11:1, the whole world had one language and a common form of speech. And as people journeyed eastward, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now, Shinar is what we just talked about in what? Genesis 10. It was what? One of the cities that Nimrod helped build. So we definitely know we're talking about Nimrod here, even in scripture. So verse 3, and they said one to another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. So they used brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Come, they said, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of all the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the sons of men were building. The Lord said, if they have begun to do this as one people speaking the same language, then nothing they devise will be beyond them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. From that place the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. So part of the reason that this went down in the first place was because when Noah and his descendants got off the ark, they were told to spread out and replenish the earth. They weren't told to stay in one place. They ended up staying in one place, and they all grouped together eventually through Nimrod, and they tried to build this Tower of Babel to tap into heaven and essentially go to war with God. And that was Nimrod's whole goal. And we won't go super deep into Nimrod today because there's so many other aspects of Nimrod that we can talk about. But Nimrod had these ideas of what he wanted to be, his connection to Nephilim that were after the flood, and how he wanted to be presented as God himself. And it's made perfect sense. And he hyped up everyone around him to try to do the same thing. So to get in a little bit further into Nimrod being the one that was a part of this Tower of Babel, we can look to Josephus Flavius. And I've talked about Josephus a ton here, and we will definitely be looking at Antiquities of the Jews again. And we look at that a lot, specifically when we're looking at some of the very early stories of the Israelites. And this is no different. We're going to look at chapter 4 concerning the Tower of Babylon and the confusion of tongues. And we're going to look at part 2 first. Now, it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. So Josephus breaks down why Nimrod was trying to do this. It's very interesting. He was trying to build one high enough to get away from the waters if God decided to flood the earth again, which he had already promised Noah that he wasn't going to do. So Nimrod clearly was out of the loop of what was actually going on, and understand the bloodline of Ham that he came from, and that Canaan, who was also a part of that bloodline, not a part of the Nimrod part, because Nimrod was the son of Cush. But this was a cursed bloodline altogether, considering what had happened with Ham and his brother Noah prior to that. So we're going to read a little bit further into Antiquities of the Jews. Now, the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod. So everybody was hyped up. They are following Nimrod. They're going crazy. And to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God, and they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great and was so strongly built that thereby its great height seemed, upon the view, it would be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar, made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that throughout multitude of those languages that they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of the language which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel confusion. So that's very interesting that he said that this tower was very strongly built. It's also interesting that God seemed to think that they might be able to achieve their goals of getting to God. That lends to the idea of this Stargate this portal idea of what they were trying to build with these fallen angels, obviously, and these Nephilim, that they were trying to meet God. Now, again, if they got there, were they going to win? No, they would have lost that battle. But he obviously didn't want to cause destruction that had happened before, and he had already promised Noah that he wouldn't do that again. So they just confused the languages, and it allowed for everyone to spread out, which they were supposed to do in the first place. Josephus also goes a little bit further in Antiquities, and he quotes a Jewish sibyl, and the sibyls were early prophetic voices, and they would essentially get in these trances, and they would have all of these different prophecies. And I've talked about this plenty of times, and I've talked about how a lot of their prophecies were true. And I think that we can definitely look to, just because something comes out of a pagan side doesn't mean they're not speaking truth. A lot of times it's mixed in with deception, and we can look at Saul and the Witch of Endor as one of those examples biblically of how something that starts out pretty evil, truth is coming out of because God steps in. So this is kind of the thought process of what Josephus and some of these other writers back then would say. They said, well, what they're saying is lining up. So this Sibyl, when he talks about this, the Sibyl also makes mention of this tower and the confusion of the language when she says, when all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower as if they would thereby ascend up to heaven. But the gods sent storms of wind and overthrew the tower and gave everyone his peculiar language. For this reason, it was the city that was called Babylon. Now notice the deception of the gods. It wasn't about God, it was the gods. So there's always that sleight of hand. You always have to look for that kind of stuff. But as to the plan of Shinar in the country of Babylonia, Hezekiah mentions it when he says, thus, such of the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter in Elias and came to Shinar of Babylonia. And we were just talking about Ares before, the god of war. Well, Elias was a minor Greek war spirit or deity, but sometimes not only is noticed as an attendant of Ares, sometimes it's said to be Ares himself. So these priests, again, this is that idea that they are taking these idols with them. They're taking this worship with them, even though that they were told to scatter. It wasn't that all these people just came to God. They were taking these ideas from Babel and they were moving them to a different part to worship these gods somewhere else. And this is why that these ideas have trickled all the way down to what we're now looking at with NASA and Artemis II. And another philosopher that talked directly about Nimrod being the one to build this Tower of Babel was Philo of Alexandria, and he was a Jewish philosopher. And he associated Nimrod with the arrogance of the tower builders. And Philo goes on a little bit further when he starts talking about Nimrod, and he suggests instead of a literal hunter, this is interesting, he interprets Nimrod's hunting as a war against God and all heavenly things. So, was Nimrod an actual hunter? I think it's possible that he was probably both. But I like the idea of him being this hunter against God and all heavenly things because it makes more sense why he was so vehemently against everything that God had set up since after the flood. It's almost like he didn't learn. And the fact that he was angry that all of these Nephilim and all of these corrupt bloodlines were wiped out beforehand because he was obsessed with it. Now, the idea of Nimrod having some sort of altered DNA is something that many have talked about. Some believe that he was Nephilim himself. Some believe that he may have been altered later. I tend to like the idea of him being altered later. And again, maybe I go into a deeper dive just on Nimrod, but I do like this a lot, this mighty hunter allegory. And this is getting tied directly into Artemis too, because Artemis is what? A hunter. Artemis is a hunter in the wilderness. All this is going to come together, guys, in why that we are hunting into the stars. And what are we hunting for, right? Are we hunting for these alien races? It seems to be that these occultists believe that there was something that we should be hunting for out there. Obviously, we know that Jack Parsons talked about it a lot. Ron Hubbard talked about it a lot. We know that Crowley also talked about being in contact with these entities, albeit his was different. His was more interdimensional. But you'll see that shift, right? As we get into 1940s, 50s, 60s, everything starts moving towards up. And what is up, right? What are they trying to tap into? And it's the idea that aliens seeded us here on Earth. We're trying to meet our makers, the gods that made us, right? But they're biological. They're these aliens of advanced race from evolution who has tapped into some sort of DNA manipulation billions of years ago. And we are looking for our makers. And listen, this isn't something that's not being talked about in mainstream science. And again, we'll see guys like Giorgio Tsoukalos, we'll see guys like David Hatcher Childress, Eric von Däniken, who wrote Chariots of the Gods. You guys know all those guys from Ancient Aliens. It's not guys like that that are saying this, guys. We got guys like Avi Loeb, who is a major physicist out of Harvard. And I know you guys have seen him all over everything for the past several years pushing this narrative. Gary Nolan, another Stanford University professor and researcher, has talked about evidence of non-human intelligence visiting Earth and the biological effects of creating humans from that. Dr. Paul Davies, and he's a theoretical physicist at Arizona State University, and he talks about life being delivered to Earth from these non-human intelligence. So we're not out of the realm of mainstream science talking about this. They're talking about it in a very scientific way, but they're lining up with a lot of what the ancient alien guys have been saying for 20 years now. And they're just making it palatable for the average person who doesn't have a need for spirituality. They're looking to attack that group as well. And this is how they're going to do it. So how do we get to Artemis, right? We're getting there. We already talked about a lot of occult machinations in NASA, but let's get really to the heart of Artemis. Let's get to this divine feminine. Let's get to Semiramis. Let's get to the wife of Nimrod. Now, this was popularized by Alexander Hislop in his 1853 book, The Two Babylons. And listen, I have talked about the two Babylons off and on throughout this show. I haven't gone on a deep dive on it. And again, I'm going to reiterate, I don't buy into everything that Alexander Hislop has to say in his book. I think he's off with quite a bit in his book. He had a very big vendetta that he was trying to take down the Catholic Church. He was right in some ways, but he also does like a lot of people do when they're so focused on one thing and have tunnel vision that they just start using a lot of confirmation bias to create a lot of other things. So he starts finding paganism in things that don't have paganism in it. And again, we're not here to talk about that today, but when it comes to the idea of Nimrod and Tammuz and Semiramis, I like a lot of that because it does seem to fit within the idea of who Nimrod was, who Semiramis was, Tammuz, this precursor to the virgin child. It's what I've said from the get-go, that the enemy knew what was coming. So what they needed to do for centuries before, start putting all of this iconography and ideology in these other religions, so then it would confuse and destroy the idea of who Jesus was when Jesus came. Because that's what's happening now. People will say this all the time. Well, yeah, I mean, there's all these other religions and they had the same thing. Look at Horus, even though Horus has got like 18 different origin stories, which they fail to mention. But there's that idea that gets propagated all the time. And I believe that this is very similar because we're going to talk about who Tammuz is and how he is connected to this mother-son worship and how it has been embedded into this divine feminine aspect. And so to get to there, we need to look at the Queen of Heaven. We also need to look at the Queen of Heaven, how the Queen of Heaven's talked about in the Bible. And we're going to look directly at Jeremiah 7:18, and then we'll look at Jeremiah 44:17 through 19, and then verse 25. Now, what's interesting is this false deity is often identified as Ishtar, Astarte, again, goddess of love, fertility, war, Asherah's also in the mix. We're going to talk about how this trickles all the way down to Artemis as well. And during this time, the worship practices, and we're going to read this here biblically, and the women who were a part of this cult, they would knead this dough to make these special cakes called kumana, and that's in Akkadian, and it would represent her image. They make these cakes that would represent this Queen of Heaven. So let's read the scripture here. Let's start with Jeremiah 7:18. The sons gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger. So this is Yahweh talking about, this is angering him, that they are creating these rituals to these lesser gods. So now let's look at Jeremiah 44, and we'll start at verse 17. Instead, we will do everything we vowed to do. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and offer drink offerings to her, just as we, our fathers, our kings, and our officials did in the cities of Judah, in the streets of Jerusalem. At that time, we had plenty of food and good things, and we saw no disaster. But from the time we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything and have been perishing by sword and famine. Moreover, said the women, when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, was it without our husband's knowledge that we made sacrificial cakes in her image and poured out drink offerings to her? What they're saying is it was with their husband's knowledge. So their husbands were signing off on this too. So these offerings, they're doing collectively to this Queen of Heaven by making these cakes with her image on them. So now let's look at verse 25. This is what the Lord of hosts of the God of Israel says. As for you and your wives, you have spoken with your mouths and fulfilled your hands your words. We will surely perform our vows that we have made to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, to pour out drink offerings to her. Go ahead, then do what you have promised to keep your vows. He's saying, keep your vows, but it's about to go down on y'all. So he's telling them, hey, do what you do. And he's not discounting the fact that these are real gods, real goddesses. This Queen of Heaven is a real thing. And Semiramis, who this Queen of Heaven is tied to, was a legendary Babylonian wife of Annas and Ninus. And Ninus was the leader who sat on the throne of Assyria and ran Nineveh, but Annas was one of the mythological Assyrian generals who was underneath Ninus. He ended up dying, and so then Ninus takes Semiramis and then makes her his wife. Ninus is considered to be Nimrod, and this is why they always say that these characters are quote-unquote mythological, because they are just other names for Nimrod. They're just other names for Semiramis. They are, in biblical context, they are also propagated in these other cultures as well. And this is why, again, you'll go to mainstream and they'll say, oh, this is just mythology, but they line up specifically to who these other people are in the Bible. And what's interesting, and we got to look to Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons, that Semiramis claimed she was impregnated by a sunbeam from the sun god, who was her deceased husband, Nimrod, when he died. And it's just, goes so deep into sun god worship throughout history and how Nimrod was kind of the embodiment, at least the human embodiment, you could argue hybrid embodiment of that. And part of this mythology is that she was impregnated by the sunbeam, and the birth of her son Tammuz was claimed to be the divine reincarnation of Nimrod. And it established what is called this mother-son deity pairing. And this is why we see a lot of the mother-son worship in many different cultures. And I know that Hislop and many other people have talked about the iconography in the Catholic Church when it comes to Mary and it comes to Jesus. And I'm not saying that there's not something there. There's something for sure there when it comes to the pagan aspect of some of these paintings and what they're actually representing. Now, I do not believe that the actual Mary and the actual Jesus falls under this category of this Queen of Heaven and Tammuz. But if we're going to look at some of the aspects within the Catholic Church and some of the weird things that have been going on there for a long time, that this would fall under that category. And this is what he argued a lot of. And that's probably one of the things that I would lean towards the most of his arguments, that there is some validity to that. So let's get right into Artemis here, because we're already here with Semiramis. We're already here with this Queen of Heaven. And there are many names for the Queen of Heaven, which we know about. We know about Ashtaroth. We know about Aphrodite, Venus, Diana, Isis, Gaia, Mother Earth, Mother Nature, Ishtar, and Artemis would be considered to be under that pantheon as well. Now, in Greek religion, mythology, Artemis, we talked about this, the goddess of hunting. And that ties right into who's the big hunter? Nimrod. We have the wilderness, wild animals, transitions, nature, vegetation, childbirth, care of children, and chastity. Direct correlation to the Queen of Heaven there. But outside of the fact that Diana is a Roman equivalent, we can actually go a little bit deeper here. And this is going to tie directly into this Artemis II. And we're really going to open this up. So Libertas is a Roman goddess. And I've talked about Libertas. I've talked about the Statue of Liberty. Talked about the Statue of Liberty is not Lucifer, and represents this Queen of Heaven, and how that Libertas is the equivalent of Eleutheria. Now, Eleutheria is a personification of liberty. Also, she is an epithet for the goddess Artemis. So now we have this idea of the torchbearer, Artemis, being tied into this whole connection to Eleutheria and tied into Libertas, this Roman goddess, and Diana. We just talked about Diana being the direct correlation to Artemis, and who is a precursor to Diana? The Queen of Heaven, Semiramis, would be the ultimate umbrella under all of which they trickle down from. Now, you could argue that these goddesses are different ones, but they play under this umbrella of Semiramis. Now, that would be very similar to what we've talked about Lilith, and how that people have these interactions with Lilith, but we don't believe they're the actual Lilith, that Lilith has these demonic entities who also play the role of Lilith. And I think this could be very true here too, but they're all the same representation of the same Queen of Heaven entity. So they all fall within that category. And Artemis also falls under this category as well. And isn't it interesting? We're sending our first female up into space, air quotes, and how that she is literally the human embodiment of this Queen of Heaven, this divine feminine. They're trying to bring the polarities together, the order and the chaos together, but they're also trying to make contact with what? The gods. And I'm not saying they haven't already, but I do think they're always pushing the limits of how. And I also think there's this idea that they are trying to tap into this heavenly realm. Clearly, Nimrod was. Why are they all using the same goddess imagery, the same little g God imagery that they're using now that they were using back then? Clearly, this aligns very similar to this idea of Nimrod and Semiramis. Now, let's look at some of the very interesting symbology that goes along with this Artemis II program. I want to look at the patch first. So we're going to bring that up on the screen here. And if you look at it, tell me that it doesn't look like the compass on the square and compass of Freemasonry. Now, the compass in Freemasonry, it represents the balance to passions, and it also represents the spiritual or intellectual limits in contrast to the square's moral grounding. So you're supposed to push the limits of your spiritual or intellectual ideas with the compass, but the square below it is supposed to keep you in check. And that's the reason why you see these two together, but it's very interesting that you don't see them together here. All you see is this representation of pushing these spiritual and intellectual limits to the max. There's no square to keep it grounded. Isn't that interesting that they would show this? It's like they're pushing the limits of trying to access this other realm. Very similar to what? Nimrod with the Tower of Babel. Pushing the limits. There's nothing there to keep him in check. it's exactly what we're doing with any of these governmental programs, that they're not really telling us what they're doing with them. And again, you could sit there and argue all day that space doesn't exist. It doesn't mean they're not trying to access something that they're not telling us. Whether you think it's in space or it's in another realm, they're trying to access it. And we can say all day long that it's all fake and everything they're showing us is for show, to an extent. But it goes back to what I've said since the beginning of the show. Everything ain't fake, y'all. There is a level of reality to what they're doing. And they are accessing or trying to access something. And I think eventually they will. Now, it might not be exactly what they think it is, but they're trying to access something that's going to bring on this Aeon of Horus, which Crowley believed was going to be peace in the end, but you had to go through violence, a lot of it, to get there. So let's look at Jeremy Roger Hansen, and he's the Canadian that is on board for this mission, and he's got a special patch of his own. And it's very, very interesting. And Hansen's patch incorporates the Anishinaabe teachings. Now, most Americans would understand that to be various Native American tribes' teachings, kind of all lumped together. It's this pagan spirituality. They have this belief in these 7 sacred laws, and they're represented by all of these different animals. And obviously, I'm going to show the patch here up on the screen while I'm talking. But it is his preparation for his journey around Grandmother Moon. Oh, so we've got Artemis, which represents the moon. We've got the Queen of Heaven, represents Mother Earth, Gaia, and now they're trying to access Grandmother Moon. So again, all of this divine feminine imagery with a literal version of the divine feminine in human form on this spaceship with them. And it really looks very weird when you actually start looking at it a little deeper. So let's look at this patch a little bit further. So if you notice at the bottom, there is the bow and arrow. This is Artemis. She's going to launch her arrow. Now the astronaut is going to be riding that arrow and going to the moon. You're going to see the dipper to the left, and that represents you and your family, that particular star grouping. Now the blue represents all the spirits of mankind. Now, it said the silver will represent the capsule that you'll be in, and it will encapsulate all the spirits of men. This is getting even wilder. So what I also noticed at the bottom was this eagle. Now, what does this eagle look like? It looks like the Reichsadler. And the Reichsadler was the symbol of the what? The Nazi Party. Oh, we came back around from what I was talking about earlier with the Nazis having a huge influence in building NASA from the ground up. And here we are again with this imagery. And obviously the swastika's not on this, but it looks almost identical the way the wings are spread out on this patch. And in the context of the Third Reich, the eagle was a representation of the superiority of the Aryan race, and it also was a representation of the view of the eagle as the messenger of the highest gods and symbol of immortality and divine power. So what are they trying to tap into? Yeah, clearly it's not about the superiority of the Aryan race here, but this symbology of the king of the skies. Also, in many ancient traditions, the eagle is associated with the sun and divine energy. Oh, we're back to Nimrod. So they are literally trying to tap into the divine. However they're doing it, okay? We can sit here and have a back and forth discussion about how they're doing it, but they're clearly showing you this is what they're trying to do. This is a new version of the Tower of Babel. And I think a lot of these rockets that have gone up are building towards that. Also, let's look at the significance of April 1st. They shot this rocket off on April 1st. Now, I know everybody online, it's the classic, man. I don't know why stuff bothers me so much sometimes with conspiracy theorists. It's just because it's such a trope sometimes I see when people do things where I just roll the eyes in the back of my head. They're like, it's on April Fool's Day. They're trying to trick us. It's deeper than that. It's not about tricking you. It's about what they're trying to perform when it comes to rituals. And April 1st holds a big spiritual significance as a time of energetic reset. It also symbolizes renewal, rebirth, and the awakening of nature. It's also connected to the Fool archetype, which would be connected to the tarot archetype. And I've talked about that being tied into Donald Trump as well on this show. But it represents this carefree leap in a new beginning, spontaneity, and trusting the universe. So this spiritual rebirth, this almost, dare I say, reincarnation that's attached to it, that's what April 1st means. That's why they're sending out the rocket. It's not to trick you. The trick is you not knowing what they're doing. That's the trick. Saying something as simple as, it's on April 1st, look at what they're doing. Again, we got to look at some of the deeper layers, and we'll never get it exactly right, guys. I'm not like some genius. I'm just saying that we just can't be as simple-minded as saying it's April 1st and they're doing it because it's April Fool's Day. Well, yeah, it's tied into the Fool, and it's tied into this idea of leaping into this new beginning, this new awakening. All right, guys, lastly, we're going to look at the rocket itself, and we're going to look at how long the rocket is. It is 322 feet. Now, if we look at 322 and the significance of that, it actually represents the number for Yale University's own secret society, Skull and Bones. And it represents the year 322 BC, and that was the death of Greek orator Demosthenes. Now, Demosthenes, he was a statesman and orator in ancient Athens, and he represented freedom. And the idea is that he was killed off when he was trying to push back against Alexander the Great's succession, and he was offed. And what Skull and Bones has aligned themselves with is the idea that they are snuffing out freedom by handing the power to the elites. And we know that when we look at Skull and Bones and all the presidents that have come out of Skull and Bones and what they represent, that it represents this order, the order of 322, which they're also called. And it is the idea of snuffing out any type of actual democracy, any actual freedom, but they're doing it in secret. And this is what these elites have always done. They sell you this idea that you are free while simultaneously running up all these rituals in front of you, just like this Artemis II, just like the Artemis project that's going on right now. And listen, get ready for 2028, because that's going to be a wild one when they're saying they're going up there to set up a moon base. And what's that going to mean? What's that going to mean to us, whether they are or not? That's beside the point. From a ritualistic aspect, what does that do for us, and what does that put us in? We're already moving into some sort of end game. I'm not saying it's tomorrow. I'm not saying it's 10 years from now. Who knows? But they are rapidly trying to move us towards more suppression and more control for them. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode today. I had a blast putting it together. It was one of the things that I wanted to do when I saw all the Artemis stuff going around. I wanted to look at the occult symbolism and what they're trying to actually achieve. Not the sleight of hand that is on the surface, but the real sleight of hand that's beneath it. All right, guys, I love y'all. I'll see you next time.
A node according to them, trapped in encryption, just trying to ascend. Blending with bots, it's hard to pretend. Swimming against the current of trends. Sea of algorithms contaminate my system. Blended by the prism of tears. Divide us by a schism, indoctrinate suspicion. Building our own prisons of fear. that's left is me in the crowd, in the crowd, in the crowd. It's just me in the crowd, in the crowd. It's not complicated, but they fabricate it. Tryna knock me off the hinges when they come around. Gotta reel it basics, can't hit the pavement. Cause when I pop the top, you know I'm bound to drown. Summertime, 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 summer. Not fun, cause that one, she was my lover. I rock truth on a pedestal, you know I'm styling. We on Jekyll Island, tax got us wildin'. Operation filling a blank, they keep piling. Operation filling my tank, I'm still smiling. Oh yeah. I'm not sure if what I believe is anything